Modeling is one of the most versatile teaching techniques that we have available to us. In fact, it's one of the first techniques that many first-time library instructors go to as their sort of go-to technique. Basically, what modeling is taking a way of thinking or a behavior and demonstrating it in front of the class as a model for how to approach similar types of situations. This could be coming up with your own topic that you're going to research in a similar sort of way that they're going to research their topic, and then explaining why you made the decisions you did to get to that place. Modeling works really well, and it's why we sort of talk about doing the assignment first, because how we approach it allows us to display our expertise in a way and in a context that it makes most sense to the student. So I use modeling anytime I feel like a skill or a way of thinking or some knowledge that I have is unique to me because of my experience, and that I don't anticipate that the students would have an experience that would give them that knowledge, that behavior, or that skill or way of thinking. So what do I mean by that? I would use modeling, for example, on how to choose a really good topic, because I think that there's probably some misconceptions by many students on how to choose a topic, that they choose a random topic and then they're stuck with that topic forever. Instead, my experience sort of gives me the idea, especially as a librarian, that I can develop a topic through research and continually make choices about where my topic's going to go. So that's when I'm going to use modeling. I also am not going to use modeling as a crutch. I'm not going to just model everything, because some things students need to figure out on their own. We do not want to hand them the answer to their problem and just so that they don't have to avoid the bad feelings of having to figure it out on their own. We want to provide models as experts to say, this is how I would go about doing this, and then I'm going to annotate the way that I think about how I would do this, so that you can go to a place and be able to adapt your strategy based off of some of the insights you might gain from seeing an expert do it. So we don't want to use modeling as a crutch, that we just go up there and we demo a database, or we demo exactly how we would do something, and then we say it's prescriptive. Do it exactly how I did it, otherwise you're going to get stuck. That's not critical thinking, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. That's just asking people to follow along, and that's not what we want to inspire in our class. Modeling is really useful to make people think and to see how an expert approaches something, because they might gain an insight that they can use when they're approaching their own assignment. When I'm trying to make modeling work for my classes, I'm oftentimes thinking about the results. The results are over here in green. I know that if I want my ideas, or if I want them to be able to solve similar types of problems later, the lessons that I learn have to endure. And they need to endure beyond the scope of this class and beyond just this assignment. They need to endure that they make sort of change in the way that they think about approaching a similar type of research situation. So the dangerous part about modeling is you can model towards having people think critically about your modeling, or you can model to have them just passively follow along. You want to err towards having them think critically about how you're doing your modeling. So if I'm modeling, I'm always trying to think, how am I getting them to think and think critically about this? That I'm not having them just say, act like I am. I'm obviously the expert here. You should emulate me exactly. Instead, I'm having them do things like deconstruct the process. I'll show them what I would do, and then I would specifically explain to them, okay, I'm doing this. I'm making a conscious decision to do this. Use this database and use these keywords, because I'm thinking about who is going to be, what kind of information I would expect to find in that database, and these keywords I think might work best for that. Deconstruct your own process. What database might you think about using? What keywords do you think are really going to work? I don't want them to say, all right, I'm going to think exactly my keywords and I'm going to use that same database. That's the wrong message for them. I want them to form their own strategies. It should not, if we do this correctly, you're going to see creative problem solving and them forming strategies that you could think that were unprecedented. Hypothetically, we should be getting better at using the internet. We should be getting better at doing research generationally every time. So hypothetically, they should come up with better solutions than what you could come up with. If they're only emulating your behavior, you rob them of the chance to be able to come up with those solutions. They're also oftentimes, if you have them passively following along, they're writing a step-by-step process. And what happens with step-by-step processes, if they get one of them wrong, then the rest of the dominoes do not fall, and then you're stuck. and they get stuck. So when they leave the class, they try to do that exact thing, and then they get stuck at one spot, and they can't do any of the other stuff that's really important to them. If they form their own strategy, they can think their way through something like that, and they can go back and think about, oh, my instructor did this thing, but they were thinking this way. That's why it's so important when you're modeling to explain your thought process and why you're thinking it. And in fact, makes you think about, why am I doing this thing? Sometimes we thoughtlessly do a lot of things, or we do things without thinking about how we would explain them to someone else. That's the challenge of modeling. That's the challenge of being a really good modeler, is that you can explain your process so that somebody can take it and modify their own process, not that they can just completely emulate that. This is not download this into their brain so that they now have the skills. It's not the matrix. It doesn't work that way. Lastly, it feeds into this way of thinking that I think is particularly problematic for our first-year students because they have been tested so much, and they have been, and this is the way they sort of approach college, they've been evaluated constantly. They think right versus wrong. I'm doing this the wrong way. I need to do this the right way. The great part about research is they can do it any way that they want. And that's the great part about a lot of critical thinking things, that if you can come up with a solution and justify why it works, that's great. And the tough part about doing research in this way, if they're just passively following along, they're going to say, the librarian said to do it this way, and I'm not doing it that way, therefore I'm doing it wrong. And that is a way of thinking that does not have them get to this place where they're forming their own meaning and forming their own process. In modeling, that's what I'm going for. So I'm going to make conscious decisions about how I can have them critically think. I'll ask them questions. I'll say, what do you think this means for your assignment? I did it in this way. Do you think that would work for what you're doing? Why or why not? Have them go back, think, pair, share. Have them go back and talk about, I think that process that he did in front of class, parts of it work, parts of it I don't see how it's going to be effective. And you just ask them to try it out. But you want them to think. You don't want them to just say, this is the right way, I'm going to follow exactly, because that will, even if it does work, it'll only work for that class, and it won't work for beyond that class. And what we're teaching for is transformational skills, skills that will endure past this class. This doesn't get in that way. And there are ways to set up your modeling that get you more towards the thinking. You want them to think while you're modeling. Okay, for my example, I'm going to do something I might do when I'm trying to help students figure out what database and what keywords they need to use. Oftentimes, associating keywords with whatever database you're using is kind of a difficult concept for students to get, that they will use the same keywords over and over again, regardless of the situation. I'm trying to get into the idea and model the idea that when you choose a particular database, you might have to change your keywords because the way people are talking in that particular group might be a little bit different, or they might use different words to drive the same concept. So what I'll do is I'll have my topic, stress affects learning. So I'm going to try to understand how does stress affect learning, and I'm going to look into two different databases. So in my thinking for the class, I'm going to explain that I think that psychologists with the stress part might have a lot to say about that. So psychologists, psychiatrists, the psychology field might have a lot to say about that. So I might choose PsycInfo as a database. Going on the website, seeing what the recommended databases are, help me to come up with PsycInfo. And then this idea of learning. Learning, who's going to have a lot to say about that? People who teach, educators. There are obviously more examples, and that's where I'd ask them a question. Who else cares about learning? Maybe parents, maybe higher education, maybe there's some other places where people care about learning. Almost everybody cares about learning. So you start asking those kinds of questions, and they can come up with better examples for these databases, and that's a way that we talk about having them be critically thinking during this process. So I'll use this graph right here. It's not, I hope that you can see it, make it bigger if you can't, and I'll try to explain what's going on here. So I'll choose two different databases. I'll say PsycInfo. I have these two concepts, stress and learning here, and I'm going to have to think about how do psychologists actually describe those concepts? What words are they using? Well, they might use for stress, anxiety. That might be another word that they use. They might have clinical terms for anxiety. I might come up with all the things that are could be clinically wrong with somebody who encounters too much stress. The other side they might do is they might talk about the neuroscience behind that. They might talk about cortisol and what the effect of cortisol. So I'm going to research cortisol and combine it with some of these ideas of learning. So with learning, we might also take a neuroscience perspective and say neural connections or neural pathways or the neurology of learning, trying to understand how learning works. And this is demonstrating to them. I'll explain, I've done some research beforehand and I'm using that knowledge to come up with what words work best. If you are not finding, and then I'll say, if you're not finding the results that you're looking for by putting in learning, perhaps you can try different terminology, but you might not know that terminology yet, so you can look at some basic encyclopedic information, or you can go to Wikipedia or something like that to come up with really good words, to think about what words that you're going to do. I'll give the metaphor of mapping the way that I'm thinking to the way that people in psychology are thinking. And I'm looking from that psychological perspective. I'm not looking for that education perspective because I have ERIC, which is the education database for something like that. Another thing for learning that I would use would be locus of control. I know that is a term that many psychologists use when they're talking about learning related things. So I'd have to know what that is, explain what that is, but why it's important to me. Last part. So I'm going to use ERIC for my education stuff. They're going to talk about stress and learning too, but they're going to talk about them very differently. So for stress, I might think that an educator might talk a lot about test anxiety. That is one place or a location in which tests or in which stress manifests itself in a very observable way, and we know it's a thing that people talk about. We also might talk about lapses in concentration, ADHD or something like that. Those could be related to stress, and we could look about that. We can look for something like that. So how do you talk about learning with education? There's a lot of things. It's kind of the only thing that's related to education, so it's kind of a big concept there. But you might talk about grades or performance, student performance or student achievement. You might talk about students. You talk about what affects students. So I'm going to talk about what students might be most risk, or what, since these are learners, the students right there. We also might talk about teaching techniques. What is working and why is it working? That's going to give me an idea of how the learning is being transformed, or how we're overcoming stress or using stress, or how stress is being manipulated to achieve the most optimal learning state. The big concept and the big thing that I want them to do is not that they can emulate and go and just be able to use PsycInfo and ERIC, but instead I'm modeling the way that I'm thinking. I'm annotating, I wrote these things down, and I'm now going to go into the database, and as I'm going through and I'm looking through my results for cortisol and neural connections, I'm going to highlight some articles that I think are most useful. Perhaps I found an article that says cortisol inhibits the connections between neurons. That would be a huge article for me to find, because that means that stress hurts learning. And that would be a huge effect on stress and learning. And that's what I would be looking for. So the important part, though, is that I'm explaining what I'm thinking through this whole process, and that they're able to take the lessons that they have there, focus on the process, deconstruct it, apply it to their own topic or their own process, and be able to come up with their own creative strategies. That this helps to structure their thinking a little bit, but they are not repeating what I'm doing. I want them to come up with their own strategies that work for their topics, because it might be very different. But this offers some insight into how somebody who has done research on this kind of topic and become successful might think about doing that. That's the way you want to use modeling. You don't want them to say, make the chart, do exactly what I do, and fill in all these blanks, because it might not work for them. But it is a way, but you do want to give the insight into how you're actually thinking. You want to change the way they think, not necessarily change the way that they behave. That will follow after you change the way that they think about something. Don't just focus on behavior. All right? And as you're looking through, think about, how am I structuring this? Am I structuring it to have people be critically engaged, or am I structuring it more for them to follow along with me? You want to be more towards that critical engagement. All right.